I'll start today with just pointing one thing out about the exhibitions we have, is that this is the first photographer we've had who's shown on all 3 floors of the gallery. No photographer has done that before, so that's a first for Ivor. Going back to Ivor's previous exhibition here was in 2012, and it was about the Arab Spring. So we showed Ivor and our colleague Guy Martin's photographs of Libya and Egypt when all of the trouble started. And 9 years on, not 9 years, 8 years on, there's still trouble in all of those places, trouble in Libya, trouble in Egypt, and trouble in Syria, and all the countries around. So what I want to do is start the conversation by asking Ivor how he became interested in Syria and when he first went there.
Yeah, I mean, when the Arab Spring started, and I did that work in Egypt and Libya in 2011, 2012. I had just relocated to the Middle East probably a year and a half before, by chance, before the Arab Spring had started, and was just planning to base myself there and work in the region and cover the region as a young photographer starting out. And then the Arab Spring started, and it was this huge, momentous occasion, period of history and change in the region. So naturally, I went and started covering it, and that that was the start of me, really doing kind of news coverage and covering conflict in any way. I hadn't really done that before. So we went to Egypt first, and then followed the story to Libya because it kind of happened like that in a kind of knock-on effect. And Syria started at pretty much the same time in early 2011. And yeah, I probably spent most of 2011 covering Libya, and then pretty much straight after that relocated to live in Turkey, based myself in Istanbul. And Syria at that point was the big, ongoing story, and the civil war had erupted all over the country. And I really started covering that from the humanitarian side, outside of Syria, not inside. Partly because it was incredibly difficult and dangerous to go into Syria, because if you wanted to go in, you had to basically sneak in across the border and embed yourself with the rebels who were fighting against the regime at that time. And I wasn't really up for that. I just thought it was so laden with risk, and Libya had been pretty dicey, and I think both me and Guy had realized the dangers of covering conflict, especially when you were embedded with a rebel force, fighting against a fully kind of militarized army. So that's how it started, and I ended up working all over the Middle East, covering the outflux of people who were leaving Syria, which at its peak I think is over 4 or 5 million people who've left, and then internally there are millions also displaced. So it's the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time, and that's why I was interested in it, and I probably covered it from 2012 until 2016, when the European refugee crisis happened, and you had, millions of people coming, but a large portion of them were from Syria, and so I followed it and continued to focus on Syrian refugees, and that's what led me up to doing this work in Iraq and Syria in 2016, 2017, 2018, when the operation to defeat ISIS started. So that's kind of the genesis of how I ended up doing this work, which is mainly what's on show, although the Syria work, the refugee work, is downstairs in the bookshop.
And it'd be interesting for you to explain how that work was supported financially, morally, ethically. Who was behind you, pushing you? What did they want from your interaction with the people?
The Syrian refugee work, you mean?
Yeah,
all of it.
All of it. Because you start small and then you get different backers as you go through.
Yeah, no, for sure. So in you know, and I probably talked about this the last time I was here in Egypt and Libya. I was really starting out, so I was funding a lot of it myself. I was just putting myself on the ground and making pictures and doing stories and then trying to sell them after the fact. Sometimes I would get assignments and, you know, I would be working for someone specifically on the ground, but often I was trying to sell the work after the fact, which is, you know, how a lot of my colleagues do it, how I still sometimes do it, but that's how it was then. And then, you know, as things progressed, when I was doing a lot of the Syrian refugee work, I was working in collaboration with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, who had at the time a kind of media team who were specifically designated to cover the Syrian refugee crisis because it was such a big issue in the region and worldwide. So I was hired by them to be a photographer, which was an incredible opportunity, and how I did a lot of that work.
Yep.
And then when it came to covering the ISIS stuff in Iraq and Syria, I've done most of that on assignment for the New York Times. So, you know, gradually ended up doing exactly what I wanted to do all those years ago, which was work for mainstream big news organization covering the stories that I feel passionate about, and that's, you know, that's what really ended up what I ended up doing with the Caliphate work, working with the New York Times. But it took about 10 years.
In terms of the ISIS work, where do you think it's going to go from here? Have you finished covering that theme, or do you think it's going to...
Personally, yeah. I mean, I feel like I've drawn a bit of a line under it myself, but that doesn't mean it's over by any means. Like the main military operations stopped earlier this year in early 2019 when they took back the last kind of parts of the so-called Caliphate from ISIS in Deir ez-Zor in Syria. But that's not to say that the group are completely gone in the region. They're not. They've lost their real estate in the region, but they still have thousands of people who support them, and thousands of fighters who probably slipped through the security net and are in hiding, and they're already carrying out insurgent style attacks, you know, attacking police stations and killing prominent figures in tribal areas to disrupt the kind of rebuilding of the country. And that's what they were doing before 2014 when they came to power. So it's kind of like, well, is it going to repeat itself? Yeah. I don't think it will anytime soon, because there's too much of an awareness of that happening again. And you have these, huge forces that have been formed in response to ISIS over the last 4 or 5 years. In Syria, you have the Kurdish forces who are backed by the coalition to fight against ISIS, who are now very powerful and holding their territory in Syria, who are very aware of the threat of ISIS coming back. And in Iraq, you have all of the militia who were also formed in response to ISIS and are now some of the most powerful kind of military forces on the ground in Iraq. And so it'll be really hard for them to kind of do what they did in 2014 and take over vast tracts of Iraq and Syria. But that's not to say they're gone by any means. Yeah. So what I mean is, personally, I'm kind of trying to move on and do something else, because it's been a long couple of years. But people are still dying. People are still affected by what's going on, and I'm still working there. Just personally, I feel like I've said what I wanted to say in the last couple of years, and the books come out, and I've kind of left behind something that I feel matters. But I'll continue to go back.
But your last visit was 2018?
No, 2019. Some of the last pictures here are from earlier this year in Deir ez-Zor, in the southeast of Syria, where they carried out these final kind of operations against this tiny little patch that ISIS were cornered in. It was very strange, and so those last 5 pictures are from that, where they corralled, like, you know, I mean, they didn't seemingly know how many people were there. They said at one point it was 10,000, but then like a month and a half later there were still thousands of people coming out of this tiny area. It was very strange. They were all hiding underground and, you know, in caves, and in the end it was tens of thousands of people who came out, and they're now all in these prison-style camps in Syria. Which is also the worrying thing, because in a situation like that, in you know, a refugee camp that you cannot leave, that is under armed guard, you know, in somewhere like Syria where the weather is pretty brutal, especially in the summer, and the conditions are really hard, you're breeding a lot of resentment, and particularly amongst children, you know, children who were born, you know, in the last 3 or 4 years, and their life has only been under bombardment, and now they're imprisoned in these, you know, in these camps, and a lot of them are foreign, you know, of foreign parents. So the question is, what are countries who allowed their citizens to go to Iraq and Syria going to do about these women and children who are in these camps? And that's the other big question, which, you know, feeds into what we were saying before, is, you know, what's going to happen in the region in the future. That's one big question mark, because a lot of people are afraid that, you know, it's just breeding the next generation, and there's a big fear that there's going to be, you know, mass breakouts. The men, you know, the kind of fighters and fathers of and husbands of these women and children are in prison, like are in actual jails. And they've already attempted these kind of mass breakouts. So it's a real, you know, it's a real issue, and the rest of the world, most of the countries whose people are there, including the UK, France, Germany, you know, aren't really making a concerted effort to do anything about it. And I think it's a real tinderbox. You know, it's very easily going to turn into the next big problem in the region. So that's where it culminated.
I wanted to ask you, as a photographer, about your personal safety and the role of fixers and people around you, and how they enabled you to do all this work.
Yeah, I couldn't have done, you know, any of this without all of the help I've had from various fixers and drivers on the ground in these places, and they're more often than not, they're people from the regions where I'm working, and they put their lives at risk to help us do our work. And I've said it countless times before that, you know, there's no way I could have done any of this without them, and it's in that way it's a collaboration, and so particularly with the work in Iraq and Syria, covering the fall of ISIS, it was integral to have this local knowledge of the area and the region, both in terms of safety, but also in terms of getting access and gaining people's trust, because it was a very paranoid culture at that point. You know, there was so much suspicion. People were very wary of these foreigners, you know, the first kind of foreigners they'd seen in years, if ever, coming in and, you know, and telling them that they wanted to kind of tell their story. So I've worked with a handful of amazing people in Iraq and Syria, and
this would be coming from Baghdad, or coming in with the Kurds.
Yeah.
Different routes into the.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, it's usually the case that you will work with different people depending on where you are.
Yep.
So for the New York Times, they have stringers and fixers all over the region in different parts of Iraq and Syria that they work with on a regular basis, that they know and trust. And so it depends where you go. link up with the local crew who are there, and they'll help you set stuff up, give you a security briefing. And it's worth noting as well that, like, with most of that stuff, particularly in any sort of frontline situation, we were working with Western security advisors as well, ex-military security guys who are there with us all the time as well to give overwatch, and they're trained medics, so if anything goes wrong, they're there to give you kind of life-saving treatment, and they're also, integral to a lot of this. As much as I don't like working with loads of people.
So would you be working by yourself, or would there be a pool of photographers going into these situations?
So for a lot of the stuff in Mosul, in particular, I was on my own. I was with my fixer and security advisor, but there were very few other photographers and journalists around in a lot of the situations where I was, because I had particular access. It was very difficult to get access in Mosul. But it was possible if you had the right connections and you were on the ground for long enough, but there was a lot of sitting around and waiting. But if you persisted and you had these channels, which I had, and I had help from the New York Times and their guys on the ground, you could find a way in. And I mean, the other thing is they gave me the freedom to work on this, work on these stories for weeks. Often people don't have that luxury. They've got a couple of days on assignment, or they can only afford to fund themselves for a short period of time. But I was very lucky in that I had a lot of time to do this stuff. So I was talking to someone earlier, Chris, where is he? Yeah, about the kind of peculiar nature of covering something like this. It's really, I don't even remember how I did half this stuff. It was like a series of 100 different things that would lead to one picture. It was so complicated, and when you think about the amount of time you spent planning and just waiting for that opportunity, it was like the imbalance is huge. So it's a real waiting game. Yeah.
So would you find yourself in a security camp with military people just waiting to leave?
Yeah.
Quite often, days on end?
So you would initially be waiting in a hotel in a normal place like Erbil, which is in the Kurdish controlled part of northern Iraq, which was only an hour or so away from Mosul, but might as well have been in a different country at the time, because there was conflict going on and ISIS were still in control. And you would be there planning and waiting for the green light to be able to go in, and then you would go in, you would link up with your contacts who were going to take you inside. And in most cases for me, I was being kind of snuck inside, because as much as you would have commanders on the ground who wanted you to be there and agreed to help you, the orders from up above, from the top brass in the military, and also from the coalition, from the Americans, they didn't want journalists embedded right on the front line seeing all of this stuff and putting themselves in grave danger, because it was incredibly dangerous, and they didn't want a bunch of journalists being killed, obviously. But I think it was more to do with the controlling the flow of information. But you would find these characters who were willing to help you for whatever reason, and you would link up with them, and then they would kind of sneak you in through checkpoints into the kind of battle area, and you would embed with a frontline troop of their men, and then you just had to.
And did you stay there?
Yeah, you
for
would.
A long duration?
You would. Well, probably not as long as you would think. You would get 3 or 4 days at most inside, and then you would have to come out, because they would be like, okay, we don't want to get caught having you here, so you need to leave. And you would go back, take a shower, take a couple of days break, and then you would go back again. That's how it worked, you know. But in total, it was, you know, it was weeks on the ground.
Yeah.
But I would never stay, you know, I would never stay in country for more than 3 or 4 weeks probably, and then I would go home to Istanbul and like take a break. That's really important. So yeah, that's basically how it worked. I could go into more detail about, you know, specific. But in terms of where you were staying, you were embedded inside.
You were eating what the guys were eating. You were drinking and sleeping where they were.
Yeah, everything. There's no other option. Yeah, it's not like you can't even bring your own car inside. So you know, you drive your car to a certain point outside, probably link up with your person who's going to take you in. Then you switch into a military vehicle, kind of hide, are taken inside, dropped off. That goes back, and then you're on foot with these frontline guys who, you know, have probably been in there for months and are living by kind of moving from neighborhood to neighborhood as they fight ISIS and push ISIS further inside the city, and then they take over new abandoned people's homes that are abandoned inside the city, and they take them over and turn them into these kind of temporary military bases, but inside the city. And so that's where you would sleep, but that would be like the case for a couple of days, and then they would move on again. It was very fluid. It was very, you know, kind of transient, and you were sleeping. I mean, places you ended up sleeping were just ridiculous. And
in that situation, did you have contact with the outside world?
They what they would do as they were on operations though was cut the cell phone coverage in the area, so ISIS couldn't communicate.
Okay.
So actually, when you were really on an operation, there was limited cell phone coverage, but we had satellite phones and stuff to be able to make contact with editors and loved ones if needs be. But largely, you were kind of off the grid because it was, you know, really really dangerous situation. You had to focus on what you were doing, and you know, like I said, it would be for 3 or 4 days, and then you would come out anyway. But if anything happened, we had satellite phones, and they had radio contact with their, you know, commanders back at the rear bases, or even with the coalition in some cases with the Americans.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Although the sort of local commanders were quite happy about being in there, how did the frontline guys feel about it? Because, you know, they're right at the edge, and you might be a liability. So totally, I'm not saying you are, but you.
No, it's a good question, and they did view you with a lot of skepticism when you first turned up, you know, and they wondered whether you would be able to keep up, whether you would, you know, put them in more danger than they were already in, for sure. You know, that I think that's the same with no matter which military force you're with. That's always the kind of first thing these guys will ask when a civilian turns up, is like, you know, are you going to get us killed? You know, trying to protect you and look after you, and so you've got to prove yourself to a certain extent, you know, and it's a slow process before they really trust you to be allowed to kind of go with them. So in the beginning, you know, you're like left behind when they go off on an operation. You're like, oh, and then, you know, slowly after a couple of days of you hanging out and kind of not going away. Yeah, you're kind of like a fly that doesn't go away. No, but you kind of, you know, you slowly prove yourself, and then you go, and it's this. I think it's the same with, you know, us as colleagues. When you work in these kind of places, you bond very quickly with people because it's so extreme. So you know, you go out on one operation and, you know, they get in a firefight or it's a bad situation, and you don't run away, and you keep working just like they are, and then they have respect for you, and then they, you know, you show them. I would show them the pictures at the end of the day, and they love that. I also would bring a lot of war movies on my laptop, and we would like gather around and watch these really bad Hollywood action movies, which was great. Yeah.
How did you sustain yourself in terms of camera equipment and gear? Did anything die on you, or was it all fairly straightforward?
No, I was pretty lucky. I probably had to change cameras a number of times because they were getting battered. And the problem is, when you actually went inside on an embed, you had to pack so lightly, you know, because you were carrying your body armor, you know, whatever clothes you needed, which weren't ever many, you know, because there's no point in bringing a load of clothes you're never going to change, and then your camera gear. So it was really hard to bring a lot of stuff with you. So actually, I would like only ever have one body on me. One camera body on me, and I'd leave one back at the base, and then if anything happened I could go back and get the other one, but you literally couldn't carry two. No, they held up pretty well. Yeah.
And were you filing from the front line at times?
No, it wasn't really possible. And I was working in a way for the New York Times, like I said, where I had this freedom to do my own thing for up to 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and the idea was to come out with like a kind of big feature at the end of it. It wasn't daily news coverage, you know, because that was being done by other people, the amazing wire photographers that were there. So we were trying to do something different, where I would build like a story over 2 or 3 weeks, and again, that was a very privileged position to be in, so I didn't have to file inside. I didn't even really you know, have much contact with my editors in that time. You know, he was just like, you know, David would just be like, you know, do your thing, let me know when you're finished, you know. That was it.
Were there any situations where the guys you were with sort of said, okay, stop with the camera now, you stay here, we're going somewhere else?
Yeah, numerous occasions, yeah. And for different reasons, either because they thought it was too dangerous, and you know, when they said that, I trusted them, because it was, you know, and like there were on every embed, and you know, with every movement, me and my security guy are discussing whether it's a good idea to move any further forward as well, and so. We were more cautious than them, so when they said, you know, we're going on operation, or we're going to that house over there, you know, I don't think you should come, we didn't go, because it usually meant it was a bad idea.
I mean, because the reports of moving into ISIS territory were very expressive about the booby traps, bodies being booby trapped, cars being booby trapped, toilet seats being booby trapped. Mines everywhere. Yeah,
it was terrifying. You could drive yourself mad thinking about it, you know, and at a certain point you kind of just had to let go and hope for the best. But I was pedantic about, you know, when I would find somewhere to go to the toilet, I'd be like looking for like 10 minutes like at the ground, looking for mines or unexploded ordnance, you know, because that was often that's often when you kind of meet your end, is like walking off the side of the road to go for a pee. So you get really kind of pedantic about that stuff, and you have to be. But yeah, ISIS were terrifyingly good at booby trapping and creating different ways to try and kill you. So like, I mean, it's worth saying that these guys would work with they, you know, amongst their troops, they would have specialists who would kind of clear rooms and stuff. To a certain extent, it wasn't always that organized, but you know, you were never like the first person to go through a door. You know, you're not armed, you're not a soldier, so you let them go through first and stand a bit back, and then you know you can move forward. So that's basically how you did it. But no, I mean. The various ways in which ISIS would attack you or try and leave presence behind for you were terrifying. the worst were the drones that they started using. I'm sure everyone heard about that. They were using just commercially bought, small drones, and had rigged them with little claws that could hold grenades or explosives of some sort, and then they would fly them over your position, over the troops' position, it's got a camera on it, so they can see where you are, and then drop the, try and drop the grenade into the, they were usually trying to drop it into a Humvee, or in through the turret of a armored car, because that would be maximum.
And that's
damage.
why this picture over here is trying to shoot on them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was the last ISIS drone I ever experienced. Yeah, and it's terrifying because you can't really see it. You just hear it, and then they start trying to shoot it down, which is also a bad idea because your chances of shooting down a drone are pretty small, and then you've got all the bullets raining down on you as well. So best thing you do is just find hard cover and hide. But that was a new thing. No one had really done that before. And then their use of car bombs. I don't know.
They're downstairs.
There's that. That other big print downstairs of the aftermath of a car bomb, which was their favorite tool of destruction, and they would leave these guys behind. As they were retreating, ISIS would leave a suicide car bomber behind, hiding in a destroyed building, in a garage, out of view. And then as the Iraqi forces would be moving into an area, they would zoom out and try and hit them. And so, when they got it right, they were on top of you before they could do anything. Because usually what they would try and do, what the Iraqi forces would try and do is call in an airstrike on a car bomb if they saw a car bomb, because the planes were overhead all the time watching, and there was a no drive zone in the city. So if there was a car driving around, it was a car bomb, and they would hit it. But if it was too close, if they would wait until you were 100 meters away, and then they would come out of the garage where they were hiding and try and hit the lines. And that picture downstairs is the aftermath of that happening, and it was terrifying, because there was nothing you could do. You just run, and even the troops just ran because they couldn't take these cars out. They were commercial, Hyundais and Fiats that they had up armored with steel plating, so you couldn't shoot through it. The only way you could take them out was with some sort of armor piercing missile, and they didn't always have that, or a tank, but a tank's really slow, so he's there, and the tank is like the best thing you can do is run. That was another new kind of technique that ISIS brought to Mosul in particular, and it was really hard to counter, and terrifying.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What support, and you talked about the importance of going back to Istanbul and taking a break, and obviously this is horrendous. And what support, and how did you manage to deal with the emotional impact of what you were part of, or did that come later, that you were in the moment and you were dealing with it, and then the impact of being among that? What was that like?
It usually, that stuff hits you after the fact, because in the middle of it you're focused on doing your job, and there's certainly a certain amount of adrenaline keeping you going, and it's only when you come out that you realize what you've seen and been through, and that's when it's hard and when it hits you. So it was usually when I was at home that I would start thinking about this stuff. How do you cope with that? How did I cope with that? I think it was really important to come out as often as possible and not stay in that environment for too long, and in that kind of heightened state of fear and paranoia and seeing, you know, this level of destruction for too long. And again, that's probably something I've done in the past when I was younger, when I was a freelancer and I couldn't afford to come and go as much, and I wasn't working on assignment for someone. I would, you know, you would stay for as long as you could until your money ran out. And that's when, I think that's when you really start running into trouble, you know, when you expose yourself for too long. And that can happen cumulatively as well, I guess, over years of doing this, and you need to be conscious of that. But I was lucky that I was able to come in and out. You know, people who were caught up in this weren't able to do that.
Yeah.
You know?
So do you use your learning and experience, thinking of the children that have been part of that, to maybe feed into how those children and young adults and those living with that?
I mean, that's not really my job, but
I know, just...
I mean, I guess I have in the past at least done a lot of work with NGOs and international organizations documenting that sort of thing, and that's what I can do. I'm not really trained as a counselor.
To inform and advise.
Yeah. No, and I have, and that gives me some sort of solace, I guess. And then, you know, the whole, it's important, I guess, to say that, like, the whole reason I did this and kept going back was because, you know, very few people were able to get to that point and see what was going on inside. And my concern wasn't so much the fighting and the military side of things, but the civilian impact, because people were caught in Mosul in particular, but also, you know, in Raqqa and other parts of the conflict. People were caught in between the two sides, and it was the most brutal urban combat, they say, that's not me, it's military commanders, since World War II. And you had hundreds of thousands of people caught in the middle of that. And yes, you could see people as they came out after the fact and, you know, talk to them in refugee camps, but I wanted to hold people to account and see what that looked like at the front line, at the point where people were actually coming out. And that's where a lot of these pictures were taken, you know, as people were fleeing for their lives and, like, burying their children, you know, as they're fleeing because they can't carry the bodies all the way out of the city. And, you know, these are the stories that I was there to try and convey. And again, I don't know who that's helping, but it's you know, it's bearing witness and creating a document of things that would otherwise go unnoticed and unseen, if that makes sense.
Very powerful.
Thank you.
Okay, can I ask what you're planning from now? You've been through this, and what photographic therapy do you have to go a different direction?
Yeah, no photographic therapy. I think I'm taking a bit of a break from doing, or just by chance. I'm not really, you know, in the midst of covering any big story at the moment, and that's probably a good thing, because it was really taxing doing this. I'm still working in Iraq. I was there last week again, but it's a different kind of story now. It's
with the drugs.
That was earlier in the summer. Yeah. So it's still pretty hard-hitting stuff, but it's not conflict. So it's a bit of a break for me, and I'm enjoying that, because, like I said, you can't do that all the time. I don't want to, because you will burn out, I think. But I'm still covering Iraq, and then in the next month or so, we'll be starting a new beat by relocating to Pakistan and working in that part of the world. Yeah, so I don't really quite know what I'm going to do there yet, but just will be covering the region and looking for the next kind of big project that I want to get into. But right now I'm not sure what that's going to be. Still have a few open projects I'm always working on, you know, but it feels like a funny period at the moment where I don't quite know what's going on or what I want to be doing. Yeah, it's often like that for me after you've done something so kind of taxing and consuming, and it was the same for a lot of my colleagues as well. We said it after the whole ISIS thing finished, and it's not finished, but it largely kind of out of the news now, and it's hard to get people interested in it. You feel a big hole in your life, because it's been your purpose for 3 years maybe. Some people it was more, and you're like, shit, what do I do now? But it's a good thing that it's largely over. Yeah, but we'll see.
Do we have any other questions?
One of the things, well, a couple of the things I noticed when I went round the exhibition is that you don't seem to have anything on the Yazidi community, the women that were sold into slavery and the ISIS brides. Did you feel that that was not part of the narrative that you were covering, or that was maybe a different story for someone else?
No, it was just the time at which I came to covering the story, I guess. And yeah, geographically it's slightly different as well to the areas in which I was operating. It's not to say it wasn't a huge kind of part of the whole ISIS story, but yeah, I really came at this as the operation for Mosul was starting. Yeah, I was a bit late to the table in that sense, because the Sinjar, the real kind of tragedy in Sinjar happened in 2014, and a lot of my colleagues covered it for the years after that, and I guess I was still doing the Syrian refugee story at that point, and had followed that to Europe. So this is what I mean. It's like the story of ISIS was going on for so long, from 2000, and I mean, for the people on the ground, it was going on from 2011 even, that's when they were starting to surface. So it's really impossible to kind of cover everything in a place like the Middle East. And I've often, I think in the past, kicked myself for missing things, or not having seen everything, but you literally can't. But it's a good point, and not to diminish what happened to the Yazidis. It was a absolute tragedy and crime against humanity.
Any other questions?
Yeah, the contrast between the Kurdish-controlled area, where they had their own civil society, and literally their own state within a state, and you have to get through the multiple different checkpoints and the degradation from controlled society to that. It's an hour trip, you're saying, what was that like?
Yeah, it was really discombobulating at that time, and still, and still is in many ways, and even was before 2014. I started working in the Kurdish controlled part of northern Iraq in 2010, 2011 probably, and even then it was in stark contrast to the rest of Iraq, and it was like this little bubble. And that, actually, one of the first stories I did when I moved to the Middle East was about Kurdistan and about the disparity between that tiny part of Iraq. It's not that tiny, but in the wider region, this little kind of, at the time, haven, that was booming in many ways. Sadly, that's come to a bit of an end because of the failed referendum, and the fact that the oil industry isn't really taking off the way people thought it would because they can't broker their own deals. But yeah, that's what it's always been for me, is this strange little kind of garden of Eden within Iraq and the wider region that is way safer, far more kind of politically advanced, in recent years than the rest of Iraq, and yeah, that was heightened certainly when Mosul was going on, and when even the other operations to retake ISIS-controlled areas were happening all around there, and it was just I still don't know how they managed to keep that region secure, and there were no big kind of bomb attacks within the Kurdish north. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, it's a good question.
I just wondered, do you do your own post-processing, do your own selection, or when you send the material off to New York papers or whoever, are they doing the cropping and stuff? Or
No, you do. Yeah, with them at least, I can't really comment on everyone, but generally with news photojournalism, you are responsible for your kind of post-production and the authenticity of your work, let's say, and yeah, I mean, if they really want to crop a picture, they can, but they'll usually talk to you about that. And the New York Times are very good. They don't touch your pictures at all, really. They're quite purist about it, which is good, and the way I like it. So yeah, no, I do all of my own post-production, although it's limited. It's really not much. You can't do much in photojournalism. You have to be very careful about what you do, which is right. And so yeah, it's really limited, and no one after me does anything to them, apart from these guys maybe when they were printing. But I don't know. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like you said that you would work on, you'd be in a place for 3 to 4 weeks,
Mhm.
and then over 2 to 3 weeks you'd build the story
Mhm.
and send it to New York Times, I'm
Yeah.
assuming. How did you manage to choose how to best tell a story? Because I keep looking at this image behind you,
Mhm.
and you can get so much information about what kind of neighbourhood it used to be. There's like an old wreckage of a boat,
Yeah.
some old cars,
Yeah.
and you must have taken hundreds, thousands of images.
Mhm.
It's just the whole process of trying to tell the best story, and every single one of these pictures you can get a sense.
Yeah.
Did you just have to think, what is the best way to tell a story, and was there a lot that you had to, leave behind that
Yeah.
made the cut but didn't quite get the message across?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it's important to point out that this is a small selection of everything that I shot during this time, and they're also a random selection taken from different more succinct stories that I was working on, or that I was working on with my colleagues, because in some cases, particularly after the fighting stopped and we were doing the aftermath stuff, I was working with journalists. So these are excerpts from smaller, more kind of succinct stories, like I said. And so, yeah, to answer your question, when I was there at any given time, I was trying to figure out what's the story at this time. And when the fighting was going on, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, there's fighting going on, people are caught in the midst of it, let's get to the heart of that. And that's what most of my stories throughout the actual fighting were about. Of course, they changed slightly depending on what was going on at that particular time. So, to give you an example, in the end in Mosul, it was the final stages were being carried out in this tiny part of the old city in Mosul, where this picture was taken. But this is after the fact. This is months after it had finished, and there was basically a media blackout. Like, no one was allowed get inside, and they'd actually said that the operation was over and that Mosul had been liberated, but the fighting went on for about 2 weeks after that. And that's when I was there doing my kind of fall of Mosul story after covering it for the previous year. And in that context we were thinking, okay, we don't really know what's going on here. They're not giving us real access, and even my access had been cut off at that point. I was barely getting in. And we were like, why are they doing that? And it was because they were bombing this, part of Mosul into the ground and killing anyone who was in there. And so you were trying to get at that as best you could. So in a way, that was the thinking behind that particular period was who's surviving this, who's being caught up in it. Let's see the destruction, and then, after war, after the conflict has stopped and you have more time to kind of think and move around, you can move around more freely, you can work on more kind of considered features, It's not news, it's not it's not that you're just being swept along with whatever's going on. You can think about it more. So.
With the lady in the chair, which I read about
Yeah.
in Journal of Photography. I'm glad to see it here. That was a really heart-wrenching story.
Yeah, and that was part of a whole kind of story I did about the civil defense workers in Mosul, who were the ones given the task of digging out all of the bodies under the rubble. And so she was one of the family members who would come to them. The process was you would go to them and say, my loved one was killed here, I think, because often they didn't really know. And then they would literally go with the civil defense workers who were not trained in kind of digging out bodies from a war zone. Would then go with their machinery and try and find where they were buried. So that's an example of a more kind of considered, succinct story that I did after the fighting had finished, and that's how we were working in that period. So it depends on what's going on at the time, whether it's news or it's quieter, and you can think more about these kind of features, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, it's
Yeah.
obviously been in a number of war zones. So in terms of now with the kind of ISIS camps,
Yeah.
have you kind of any idea how that can be resolved? Because obviously a lot of people are there and countries don't want them back, or and it's just trying to think of how that can be resolved.
Yeah, I don't really know myself. Yeah. It's a really tricky one, because to do it, if you were really going to do it and repatriate all of these people who have, at best tenuous links to certain countries, and are from a huge, wide range of places, so what you would need is this massive coalition of governments willing to take back their people who are hardcore extremists, who've probably killed, done abhorrent things, and hold them to account, when they go home, because that's important for, humanity and justice. But also, if you want to kind of understand why they did that, you've also got to, set up a huge psychological analysis, kind of aftercare project, and all of this costs loads of money, requires hundreds of people to do that. So I think, and also comes with risk as well, because as soon as you do bring these people back, and maybe they don't get the kind of lifetime sentence that you hope they get, they're out in 5 or 6 years, and then they're a threat to society, and you've got to monitor them. I think that's the main concern, but it's more the money and the personnel that it would require to really do it properly and bring people back and de-radicalize them. That's a huge endeavor, and some places have done it on a small scale, but the countries with the biggest number of people aren't doing it, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I just know it would require a lot of work, and that's partly why it's not going to happen. But I think it's going to blow up in our faces, really, to be honest. And it's also a bit of a tragedy in many ways, because particularly for the children who were born into this situation and had no choice in the matter, and you know, if you're being honest about it, have, you know, a connection to a foreign country are in some way, you know, their responsibility and should be cared for. And that's the real tragedy for me. Yeah, I have less sympathy for someone who travelled thousands of miles to join ISIS than I do for a kid who was born there. Yeah, but they're thrown into the mix along with everyone else and being left. So it's not right. Yeah.
Any other questions? Shall we? Okay. Oh,
One
last
more.
question.
Last
Yeah.
one. You alluded to your camera being banged up and being needing replacements every so often, and it's a really polite way of saying dangerous stuff happened. Could you give us an example?
Could be many, but I hope my mom's not watching. Yeah. Yeah, like there were numerous occasions where we were, you know, almost in just the wrong place, completely at the wrong time, and that's what it's like when you're in the middle of a war zone and you escape by chance, you know. So there was one particular occasion, I wrote about it, I think, so it is commonly known, that so we'd already had a really bad morning where the troops we were with had called in an airstrike on our position, and at one point there was a jet like coming our way about to bomb our position because someone else had called it in as an enemy position. And so that started the day, and it was like not looking good. Luckily they didn't, like called it off at the last minute, but it was a bad omen because it just got worse from there. And the airstrikes that did come in after the fact were so close that they, you know, kind of knocked us off our chairs and blew the glass out of the windows. And at that point we decided to pull back because it was too condensed, where the fighting was going on. We were too close to, you know, each other, and they were calling in airstrikes too close. So my security guy and me, I don't think he even needed to say it, we were like, we need to go back. And we went back to the kind of rear base, like one of these bases that I was talking about earlier, where the kind of, you know, command center was, and, you know, radios were, and thought we'd kind of reached safety. And we were actually eating something for the first time all day and sitting in the front room of this house, and out of absolutely nowhere a mortar landed on the street outside the house, like literally about 6 or 8 feet away from where we were sitting. But luckily there was a big gable wall in front of the house, as is often the case in Iraq, to give privacy. And let's say if the mortar had come over the wall and into the, you know, the space between the wall and the house, we would have been toast. And there were a number of other things that meant I was largely unscathed because there was no glass already in the window, so we didn't get like a load of glass in the face, and there were metal bars outside the window, which meant that the wall that was completely blown to pieces didn't come through the window either, because the bars were there, so we didn't get our head taken off by a block. And, you know, we're both like blown onto the floor. I get up, and it's one of those moments where you just like look at yourself and you can't believe that you're untouched. And the only thing I had was a burst eardrum. Yeah. So that was probably the closest that I know of to being taken out. Yeah, it was a reality check, and it certainly kind of slowed us down a bit after that. We were like taking a lot more kind of precaution after that. But there's not much you can do. Like, that's the thing, you know. As soon as you're within a kind of 3 or 4 mile radius of that kind of fighting, then that can happen, you know. So, you know, if you set foot off a plane and step into that kind of environment, you're taking a risk. there's only so much you can do to mitigate it.
We have another question over there.
Yeah, actually it's two questions.
Uh-huh.
With the embeddedness and the military security guidance,
Yeah.
how much do you feel, or do you reflect upon how much your gaze is actually directed, even when you are looking at the civilian story? So that's one question.
Mm.
And the second question, you sort of at one point talked about, I enjoy those assignments and amazing war photography. How much do you reflect on your privilege of parachuting in essence, parachuting out, going on to Pakistan, but others not having that freedom of movement? And so, because you mentioned, for example, the fate of people stuck in these camps.
Yeah.
I went to Syria with a church visa 2 years ago, and
With, sorry, who?
With the church visa.
Okay.
So I went for 2 weeks. Just it kind of, like some people will describe it as Assad's apologist, other people as war tourism, but it was really just, I had to do it after a lot of research I'd done previously. And so what you're saying about people, the children inside the camps and people growing up in the camps, I also felt that very strongly for the young people growing up inside Syria in government-held areas, in terms of being so stuck in their world and not being able to get out.
Yeah.
And sort of actually us going in, or someone like me going in and having conversations was actually quite helpful to them to have a link with the world.
Yeah.
And not becoming actually radicalised in a different sort of way to people in the camps, but nevertheless in a more nationalist form, because if you're relying on your government to keep you safe, so how much do you reflect though on your role of having that privilege? Equally, like I had that privilege of going and coming back out.
Yeah, no, I reflect on it a lot, and that's why I mentioned it earlier. It's an incredible privilege, not just compared to my colleagues, but more so compared to people who are actually caught up in this stuff and can't come and go. And it can make you, it can drive you crazy, and make you feel guilty to the point of not wanting to go and do this sort of stuff. But I don't do it for no reason, and I've quantified and kind of balanced this stuff, for years. And in the beginning was probably very reticent to go and cover conflict and humanitarian crisis because I didn't really know what I could bring to the table as a photographer, as a journalist, because there are so many other people doing it. So that was always my kind of mindset as a young photographer, was like, well, what's the point of me really going and covering that as well? And it wasn't until I felt like I could really say something different and important and realized that I was quite good at this sort of work. And in the end, with Mosul had the backing of a huge organization like the New York Times and a massive platform to show this work, that I really let myself do it and could somehow be okay with that whole interaction of going in. Like, it's really hard when you go and you meet someone and you connect, and like all of these pictures are about connections. For me, I'm not someone who just sticks a camera in your face and walks away. Even as fleeting as it might be, there'll be some sort of connection. And when you've seen someone just lose their family member and you photographed it and then you walk away, that's really hard, But I just kept telling myself that I had a purpose, and I was often the only observer, aside from military and aside from other civilians, in those kind of situations. And more often than not, people were really happy that I was there. Not happy, but like wanted to tell me their stories. Yeah. So I don't know if that really answers what you were asking, but that's how I quantify it. I can't remember the first.
What was the gaze in terms of how much you feel though that the military, especially since Mosul obviously had the airstrikes through the Western Allies.
Yeah.
And I followed Tordenhofer's, the father and son team, who've been with ISIS and obviously have done a lot of work in Mosul as well. And they're obviously highly critical of that, equally critical to the other airstrikes in Syria. So how much does the gaze, you being embedded, direct your gaze?
Yeah, it's tricky because you're embedded with a group of men who are tasked with giving you security and also allowing you to do your work. So as soon as you need to walk this very fine line between like doing your job as an independent observer, but also staying on good terms with them in order to have your access. And this is always the kind of balance as a photojournalist working in these kind of situations. And I was, like I say, I was pretty lucky in that I had this very open access. And when it came down to it, I feel like I was critical of whoever was at fault in front of me. And I directed criticism at the very people I was embedded with, because I wasn't just taking pictures, I was writing as well. I don't know if you've ever seen any of my stories, but they're all online on the New York Times, and so I had to like back up what I was photographing with words, and that was really important because it's really hard to decipher a lot of this imagery and what's gone on behind it, and even I haven't always seen everything. I've got somewhere after the fact, and I'm going on what they're telling me, and then you've got to dig, right? You've got to dig, and you've got to find out if that's true or not. And in a situation like this, it's really hard to do. Really hard to do.
Truth is very elusive.
Yeah. Particularly in the midst of war, particularly when there are big powers at play, like in Syria, like in Iraq during Mosul, not just ISIS, who were masters of propaganda and kind of disinformation, but also the West, and
full masters of propaganda and disinformation.
Yeah, and I would never say otherwise, And the level of destruction that was carried out in places like Mosul and Raqqa is yet to really be accounted for, and that pisses me off, And I hope I've highlighted that in my work, I
will be reading some.
I do. I talk about it in the back of my book. There's a lot of unanswered questions that no one really cares to answer because ISIS were these boogeymen that everyone wanted rid of, and didn't really care at what cost they were eradicated, even if it was tens of thousands of people, which is not right.
Because they were quite